3 brothers. One night, a debt that could only be paid in blood. Sophie thought she was walking into a high-stakes business meeting to save her father's crumbling empire. She was wrong. Locked inside the iron gates of the Blackwood estate, she wasn't a guest, she was the payment. But as the clock ticked toward midnight, Sophie realized that the 3 men watching her from the shadows weren't just billionaires. They were predators waiting for a sacrifice. And the contract, it demanded she accept all 3 of them before the sun came up. But Sophie had a secret too. One that might just turn the hunters into the prey. The gravel crunched beneath the tires of the black Mercedes S-Class, a sound like grinding bones that made Sophie flinch. Outside the tinted windows, the Oregon coast was being battered by a storm that had been raging since they left Los Angeles. Lightning flashed, illuminating the silhouette of a sprawling Gothic structure perched precariously on the cliff's edge, Blackwood Manor. "Stop fidgeting," Richard snapped, adjusting his silk tie. Her stepfather looked pale, his usual arrogant flush replaced by the ashy grey of pure terror. "And for God's sake, fix your dress. You look like a terrified child, not a woman of your standing." Sophie smoothed the fabric of the emerald green gown Richard had forced her to wear. It was vintage Versace, stunning and ridiculously expensive, but on her it felt like wrapping paper. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to steel herself. "You still haven't told me who these investors are. Why are we meeting them at midnight? Why here?" Richard didn't look at her. He stared at the massive oak front doors as the car came to a halt. "Because Sophie, the Sterling family, values privacy above all else, and they hold the note on everything. The townhouse in Beverly Hills, the chaotic mess your biological father left of the shipping company, everything. If I don't sign this deal tonight, we are destitute." The driver, a silent man with a neck as thick as a tree trunk, opened the door. The wind howled, smelling of salt and ozone. Sophie stepped out, clutching her clutch bag so hard her knuckles turned white. The doors of the manor opened before they even reached the threshold. There were no servants, no butlers, just a long, cavernous hallway lit by flickering chandeliers that looked like they hadn't been changed since the Victorian era. "Wait here," Richard said, his voice cracking. He pushed her slightly forward into the foyer. I have to go finalize the collateral agreement in the study. Do not wander. Do not speak unless spoken to." "Richard, wait." But he was gone, scurrying down a side corridor like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. Sophie stood alone in the silence. The house didn't feel empty. It felt watching. The air was unnaturally cold, a chill that seeped through the silk of her dress and settled into her marrow. She walked forward slowly, her heels clicking on the black marble floor. On a central table lay a single open book. It wasn't a guest book. It looked like a ledger bound in cracked leather. Curious, Sophie leaned over. The ink looked fresh. She read the last entry. October 31st, 1924. Margaret, payment consumed. December 21st, 1988. The twins. Payment consumed. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She scanned down to the bottom line. The ink was wet. December 31st, 2025. Sophia Bennett. Payment. Transfer of ownership. Transfer of ownership. A voice rumbled from the shadows of the grand staircase. Sophie spun around, gasping. Standing on the landing was a man who looked like he had been carved from marble and nightmares. He was tall, well over 6 FT, wearing a charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders with bespoke perfection. His hair was the color of raven feathers, swept back, revealing a face that was devastatingly handsome but cruel. "Who are you?" Sophie demanded, though her voice lacked the authority she wanted. "I'm Julian," the man said, descending the stairs. He didn't walk. He glided. Every movement was fluid, predatory. "The eldest. And you? You are much smaller than the pictures Richard provided." "Where is my stepfather?" Sophie backed away, but her heels hit the edge of the rug. "Richard!" Julian chuckled, a low, dry sound, devoid of humor. "Richard is currently running towards the front gate, clutching a briefcase filled with $2 million in bearer bonds. He was in such a rush to clear his debt, he didn't even say goodbye." The blood drained from Sophie's face. "He left me. He sold you, Sophia." A second voice drifted from the library doorway to her left. This man was leaner, with hair the color of spun gold, and eyes that burned with a manic intensity. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid, swirling it lazily. He wore his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, exposing pale, flawless skin. "Don't be crude, Silas," Julian chided, though he didn't look away from Sophie. "I'm just being honest." Silas grinned his teeth, looking impossibly white, impossibly sharp. "The little bird needs to know the cage she's in. Richard traded your life for his ledger to be wiped clean. A fair trade in his eyes." "I'm leaving," Sophie stated, turning toward the heavy oak doors. She grabbed the iron handle and pulled. It didn't budge. It wasn't locked. It felt like it was welded shut. "You can't leave," a third voice whispered, this one coming from directly behind her. Sophie shrieked and jumped back. The third brother had appeared from nowhere. He was different from the others. While Julian was commanding and Silas was chaotic, this one was ethereal. His eyes were a startling violet, and he held a book in his hand. He looked at her not with hunger, but with scientific curiosity. "I am Adrian," he said softly, "and the contract is sealed in blood, specifically your father's blood, 20 years ago, and now ratified by your stepfather." "I didn't sign anything," Sophie screamed, panic finally taking over. "This is kidnapping. I have a phone. I'll call the police." She fumbled for her clutch, tearing the zipper open. She pulled out her iPhone. No signal, SOS only. Julian stepped into her personal space. The air around him dropped 10 degrees. He reached out his fingers, brushing her jawline. His skin was ice cold. "The police do not come to Blackwood, Sophia," Julian said, "and you are not a kidnapping victim. You are a sacrifice, a tithe owed to the Sterling line to ensure another century of prosperity." Sophie slapped his hand away. The sound echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Silence descended, total suffocating silence. Silas stopped swirling his drink. Adrian closed his book. Julian slowly turned his face back to her. His eyes, previously a dark brown, were now bleeding into a glowing crimson. "She has fire," Silas murmured, sounding delighted. "I like it when they fight." "You have no idea what you are dealing with," Sophie hissed, backing up until she hit the cold wood of the door again. "Let me go." "We cannot," Adrian said calmly. "The ritual must be completed before the sun rises. If it is not, the pact is broken and we turn to dust. We do not intend to turn to dust." Julian stepped closer, boxing her in. He placed a hand on the door frame above her head, leaning down until his lips were an inch from her ear. She could smell him rainwater expensive scotch and something metallic like copper. "The contract requires 3 confirmations," Julian whispered, his voice vibrating in her chest. "Body, mind, and blood. You must give yourself to all 3 of us. Willingly or unwillingly, the magic does not care. But it must be done before the first ray of dawn touches the Atlantic." Sophie looked at the grandfather clock in the hall. It was 11. "You have 7 hours," Julian said, pulling back to look into her terrified eyes. "You will take all 3 of us before dawn, Sophia. The only choice you have is whether you will enjoy it or whether you will scream." Sophie's heart was beating so fast she felt dizzy. The sheer absurdity of the situation warred with the primal instinct telling her she was in mortal danger. Vampires. It wasn't possible. And yet, looking at Julian's crimson eyes, the unnatural stillness of Adrian, and the predator's grace of Silas, her logic was failing. "I won't do it," Sophie said, her voice shaking but firm. "I don't know what kind of sick game this is, but I am not sleeping with 3 strangers to pay off a debt." Silas laughed, tossing his drink back in one gulp. Sleeping with oh darling. You think this is about sex that's so brilliantly human of you. He set the glass down on a priceless antique table, leaving a ring of condensation. The ritual of the triad isn't about pleasure, it's about consumption. We need your essence to renew our immortality. Sex is just a method of delivery. Often the most efficient one, I admit. Silas, enough, Adrian interrupted. The youngest-looking brother adjusted his glasses, which Sophie realized were purely aesthetic. No vampire needed vision correction. You're frightening her unnecessarily. Fear spoils the taste of the blood. Blood, Sophie choked out. The third stage is blood, Julian clarified, stepping back to give her room to breathe, though his gaze pinned her in place. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The ritual has rules. Ancient laws that even we cannot break. Julian walked to the center of the room. We are not savages, Sophia. We are the Sterling brothers. We have lived in this region since before this nation was even founded, guarding against the darkness. We adhere to the code. The code? Sophie asked, grasping at anything that sounded like a rule she could exploit. The victim, the sacrifice, must be tested, Julian explained. 3 trials, 1 for each of us. If you pass a trial, you earn a boon, a favor. And if I fail, then we take what is owed by force, Julian said simply. And trust me, you do not want Silas taking anything by force. Silas winked at her. It sent a shiver of revulsion down her spine. But Sophie said, her mind racing. She was an analyst for her father's firm before the collapse. She knew contracts. She knew loopholes. If I pass all 3 trials, what happens then? The brothers exchanged a look. For the first time they looked unsure. No one has ever passed all 3, Adrian said quietly. The sacrifices usually break during the second. But if I do, Sophie pressed, pushing off the door and taking a step toward them. If I pass all 3 trials before dawn, does the debt clear? Do I go free? Julian narrowed his eyes. He looked at her with a newfound respect or perhaps annoyance. Theoretically, yes. If you endure the triad and remain standing when the sun rises, the bond of ownership dissolves. You would be free, and the debt would be considered paid in full by your courage. Then I accept the trials, Sophie said. You don't have a choice to accept, Silas drawled, moving behind her in a blur of motion. He whispered into her neck. But I admire the spirit. Who goes first? Sophie asked, ignoring Silas and focusing on Julian, the obvious leader. Julian checked his watch. A platinum Patek Philippe that probably cost more than her life was currently worth. The first trial belongs to the mind. It belongs to me. He gestured toward the grand library. Come, Sophia. Let us see if your intellect is as sharp as your tongue. Sophie took a deep breath. She had 7 hours until dawn. 3 monsters. 1 impossible contract. She walked past Julian, holding her head high. As she passed him, she noticed something. A portrait on the wall obscured by shadows. It depicted the 3 brothers painted clearly, centuries ago. But there was a 4th figure in the painting. A woman. She looked strikingly like Sophie, but she was holding a silver dagger against Julian's throat. Sophie made a mental note. They can bleed. She followed Julian into the library. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind them, separating her from Silas and Adrian. The rules of my trial are simple, Julian said, his voice echoing in the massive room, lined with books that smelled of dust and time. He walked to a chess set made of ivory and obsidian. We play. If you win, you pass the first stage. If you lose, I take my payment immediately. Sophie looked at the board. Chess, not just chess. Julian smiled and his fangs glinted in the firelight. A game of truths. For every piece you lose, you must answer a question truthfully. For every piece I lose, I answer one. And Sophia, I can hear your heartbeat. If you lie, I will know. Sophie sat down opposite the vampire lord. She wasn't a grandmaster, But her father had taught her the game before he died. He had taught her that the most powerful piece wasn't the king, it was the queen. White moves first, Julian offered. No, Sophie said, reaching for a black pawn. I prefer to play from the dark. Julian's eyebrows raised. Very well. Let the night begin. The library was silent, save for the crackling of the fireplace and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. Outside, the storm had intensified rain, lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows like handfuls of gravel. Sophie moved her black knight to f6. Her hands were steady, a mask of calm she had perfected during years of boardroom meetings where men like Richard tried to talk over her. Standard opening. Julian observed his voice smooth like velvet over gravel. He moved a white pawn. Tell me, Sophia, why did you really agree to come here tonight? Richard dragged you. Yes, but you didn't fight him in the car. You didn't scream at the gate. Why? He captured her pawn, the first blood of the game. A truth, Julian reminded her, leaning back in his leather chair. The firelight danced in his crimson eyes. Sophie swallowed. I didn't fight because I wanted to see him fail, she admitted. It was a dark thought she had never voiced aloud. My stepfather has spent 10 years destroying my father's legacy. I knew this investor meeting was a Hail Mary. I wanted to watch him beg. I didn't know the price would be me. Julian's lips quirked upward. Spite. A delicious motivator. It sustains us almost as well as blood. The game continued. Sophie played defensively, building a wall around her king. She needed to gauge Julian's style. He played aggressively, sacrificing pawns to open up lines of attack. He was arrogant. He assumed he would win because he had centuries of experience. Sophie saw an opening. She moved her bishop, capturing his knight. My turn, Sophie said, locking eyes with him. The painting in the hall, the woman with the dagger. Who is she? Julian's smile vanished. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. He hesitated, his hand hovering over his queen. That is against the spirit of the game. The rules were a truth for a piece, Sophie countered. I took your knight. Answer me. Julian sighed a sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Her name was Isabella. She was a sacrifice, much like you in 1894. She was the only one who ever came close to destroying us. How? One question per piece, Sophia, Julian snapped. He moved his queen, placing Sophie in check. Check. And now my question. What is your greatest fear? And don't say dying. Everyone fears death. What keeps you awake? At 3 a.m., Sophie moved her king out of danger. She felt exposed, stripped raw by his gaze. Irrelevance, she whispered. My father built an empire. I was supposed to run it. Instead, I've been reduced to a bargaining chip. I fear that when I die, the world won't even notice a ripple. Julian stared at her for a long moment. A queen without a kingdom, he mused. We have more in common than you think. The game intensified. Pieces were swept from the board. Sophie sacrificed a rook to draw Julian's defense away from the center. It was a risky maneuver, the kind that would either win the game or lose it instantly. Julian took the bait. He captured the rook, his eyes gleaming with triumph. You play with emotion, Sophia. It makes you sloppy. Does it? Sophie asked. She reached out her fingers, brushing the cold ivory of her queen. She slid the piece across the board, slamming it down on h2. Checkmate! Julian froze. He looked at the board, then at her, then back at the board. His king was trapped between her queen and her bishop. He had been so focused on hunting her king that he hadn't watched his own back. For a terrifying second, Sophie thought he would kill her. His fangs fully extended, and a low growl vibrated in his chest. He stood up, knocking the chair backward. Sophie didn't flinch. She remained seated, looking up at him. I won. The mind trial is over. Julian loomed over her, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard the wood splintered. His face was a mask of fury, But slowly the red faded from his eyes, returning to a deep, soulful brown. "You sacrificed your castle to take my crown," Julian murmured, his voice filled with begrudging respect. "Isabella tried to stab me. You outsmarted me." He straightened his suit jacket. "You passed the first trial, Sophia Bennett." Sophie let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "And the boon. You said I earn a favor. Name it." Sophie stood up. "I want to know how to kill Silas." Julian laughed, a genuine barking laugh. "You are vicious. I cannot tell you how to kill my brother, for we are bound by blood. But I will tell you this. Silas is a creature of sensation. He thrives on reaction. If you want to survive him, you must become stone. Do not feed the beast with your fear." He walked to the library doors and threw them open. "Go, he is waiting in the ballroom. And Sophia, do not disappoint me. I would hate for such a brilliant mind to end up as a mere meal." The hallway seemed longer this time. The shadows stretched like reaching fingers. Sophie's victory in the library gave her a surge of adrenaline, but Julian's warning echoed in her ears. Silas thrives on reaction. She reached the double doors of the ballroom. Whatever lay beyond, she had to be a stone. She had to be ice. She pushed the doors open. The ballroom was a masterpiece of Victorian decadence. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting prisms of light across the polished floor, but the room was empty of furniture, save for a grand piano in the corner. Sitting at the piano was Silas. He was playing a haunting, discordant melody that sounded like a lullaby for the insane. He didn't look up as she entered. "Julian, let you live," Silas said, his voice carrying over the music without him raising it. "Boring. I was hoping for a snack." He stopped playing abruptly and spun around on the bench. His gold hair was disheveled, his shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest. Unlike Julian's calculated menace, Silas radiated chaotic, raw energy. He moved faster than Julian, appearing in front of her before she could even blink. "The body trial," Silas whispered, circling her. He sniffed her hair, his nose brushing against her ear. "Julian tests the mind, Adrian tests the blood, but I test the flesh. What do I have to do?" Sophie asked, keeping her voice flat. "Become stone. We dance." Silas grinned. He pulled a remote from his pocket and clicked it. A hidden sound system came to life, filling the room with a heavy rhythmic tango. One song. "If you can stay in my arms for the entire duration, without pulling away, without screaming, and without your heart rate exceeding 120 beats per minute, you pass." He grabbed her wrist. His grip was like iron. He slapped a digital watch onto her wrist. The screen glowed green. 95 BPM. "You're already nervous," Silas teased. "The limit is 120. If it hits 121, I drain you dry right here on the dance floor. Do we have a deal?" Sophie looked at the watch. 98 BPM, deal." Silas didn't wait. He yanked her into his frame. His hand burned against the small of her back. He began to move, forcing her to match his steps. It wasn't a gentle waltz. It was a violent, predatory tango. He spun her, dipped her, and threw her across the floor, only to catch her at the last second. "Relax, darling," Silas purred. "You're stiff as a board. I'm concentrating." Sophie gritted out, 105 BPM. Silas laughed. He spun her again, his hand sliding dangerously low on her hip. "You know your stepfather sold you for money, but I would have paid double just for the smell of you. You smell like vanilla and fear. My favorite combination." He dipped her low, her hair brushing the floor. His face hovered inches from her neck. He opened his mouth, his fangs grazing the sensitive skin over her jugular. Sophie gasped. 115 BPM, careful, Silas whispered against her throat. 5 more beats, and you're dead. Sophie closed her eyes. She needed to calm down. She needed to dissociate. She thought of spreadsheets. She thought of the shipping routes her father used to map out. The Singapore run takes 3 weeks. The cargo is steel. The margin is 4%. Boring thoughts, Silas asked, reading her body language. Let's spice it up, he bit her. It wasn't a kill bite, it was a nip on her shoulder, sharp and stinging. Sophie cried out, her eyes flying open. 118 BPM, you cheated, she yelled, stumbling as he pulled her back up. There are no rules in a street fight, darling, and this is a fight for your life. He spun her again, faster this time. The world blurred. He was trying to disorient her, to make her panic. Sophie realized she couldn't calm herself down by ignoring him. He was too overwhelming. If she wanted to lower her heart rate, she couldn't retreat. She had to take control. Julian's words came back to her. He thrives on reaction. She was reacting to him like prey. She needed to react like a predator. Silas pulled her close for a final dip. Sophie didn't resist. Instead, she wrapped her leg around his waist, pulling herself flush against him. She grabbed his hair, yanking his head back, so he was forced to look her in the eye. Silas looked shocked. For a split second, he wasn't the hunter. "You talk too much," Sophie whispered, channeling every ounce of false confidence she had. She leaned in and bit his lip hard. Drawing blood, Silas froze. The music swelled to a crescendo. He tasted of copper and ice. Sophie pulled back, breathless. She looked at the watch. 98 BPM. The shock of her action had overridden her fear. The adrenaline had shifted from flight to fight, focusing her system. The music stopped. Silas stared at her, a drop of his own blood on his lip. He wiped it away with his thumb, looking at it in disbelief. Then a slow, wide grin spread across his face. It wasn't the cruel grin from before. It was the grin of a man who had finally found an equal. "Well," Silas breathed, "I didn't expect that." He looked at the watch. 98. You stabilized. Sophie unhooked her leg and stepped back, smoothing her dress. Her knees were shaking, but she wouldn't let him see it. "Did I pass?" "Pass," Silas chuckled. "Darling, you just rewrote the test." He walked over to the antique sideboard and poured 2 drinks. He handed one to her. "Drink. It's just whiskey. You'll need it for Adrian." Sophie took the glass. Her hands were trembling now that the contact was broken. "The boon," she reminded him. Silas leaned against the piano. "Right. The favor. You bit me. No one has bitten me in 300 years. I suppose I owe you something significant." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy iron key. "This opens the master's chambers in the West Wing. It's where the original contract is kept. If you survive, Adrian, you'll need this to destroy the ledger yourself. Richard signed it, but only fire can unmake it." Sophie took the key. It was cold and heavy. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Silas said, his expression darkening. "Adrian is different. Julian plays games. I play with bodies. But Adrian wants your soul. He doesn't want to break you. He wants to unmake you." "Where is he?" "The greenhouse," Silas said, gesturing to a glass door at the far end of the ballroom that led out into the storm. "He grows things there, things that shouldn't exist." Sophie downed the whiskey. It burned, grounding her. 2 down, 1 to go. She walked toward the glass doors. The wind howled outside, slapping rain against the panes. "Sophia," Silas called out softly. She paused, hand on the latch. "If you don't make it," Silas said, "I'll make sure Richard dies slowly." Sophie nodded once. "I'll make it." She pushed the door open and stepped out into the night, the wind tearing at her dress as she moved toward the glowing glass structure in the distance. The final trial awaited. The trial of blood. The transition from the opulent, music-filled ballroom to the greenhouse was like stepping from a palace into a grave. The air here was thick, humid, and smelled of wet earth and decaying sweetness. Rain hammered against the glass roof, a relentless drum beat that drowned out the howling wind outside. Sophie shivered. The whiskey Silas had given her burned in her stomach, a small fire against the creeping cold. She navigated the narrow stone paths, pushing aside hanging vines that seemed to recoil at her touch. The plants here were wrong. Roses that bloomed in pitch black, ferns that pulsed with a faint bioluminescent vein, and orchids that looked like open mouths filled with teeth. In the center of the greenhouse stood a rotunda made of wrought iron, and there, standing over a table filled with beakers, microscopes, and surgical instruments, was Adrian. The third brother looked up as she approached. His violet eyes were magnified by the stark, clinical light of a hanging lamp. Unlike Julian's tailored suit or Silas's disheveled romance, Adrian wore a pristine white lab coat over a dark turtleneck. He looked like a doctor from a time when medicine was indistinguishable from magic. "You survived, Silas," Adrian said, his voice soft, lacking the theatrics of his brother's. He didn't sound impressed. He sounded statistically intrigued. His heart rate monitor is usually a death sentence. "You have remarkable autonomic control." "I bit him," Sophie said, her voice flat. Adrian paused, a scalpel hovering over a petri dish. A rare smile touched his lips, a ghost of an expression. "Did you howl?" "Unsanitary. Silas will be insufferable for weeks. I'm here for the third trial," Sophie said, stepping into the circle of light. "The blood trial." "Yes," Adrian sighed, setting the scalpel down. "The most honest of all the trials. The mind can lie. The body can be trained, but the blood remembers everything." He walked around the table, wiping his hands on a rag. "The Sterling line is cursed, Sophia. We are not just immortals. We are a closed loop. To survive, we need fresh genetic material to stabilize our essence every century. That is what the sacrifice is, a battery." "I'm not a battery," Sophie snapped. "That remains to be determined," Adrian replied coolly. He gestured to a high-backed leather chair with restraints on the arms. "Sit," he commanded. Sophie hesitated. "If I wanted to kill you, I would have drained you in the hallway," Adrian pointed out logically. "Sit. The sun rises in 3 hours." Sophie sat. The leather was cold. Adrian moved efficiently, strapping her wrists down. It felt terrifyingly clinical. "The trial is simple," Adrian explained, rolling up her sleeve. He swabbed the crook of her elbow with alcohol. "I will take 1 pint of your blood. In exchange, I will inject you with 1 drop of mine." Sophie pulled against the straps. "What? No, that will turn me." "1 drop is not enough to turn you," Adrian corrected. "It is enough to test you. My blood is potent. It is pure darkness. If your spirit is weak, the drop will burn through your veins like acid, and you will die in agony. If your spirit is strong, if your will to live outweighs the corruption, you will metabolize it. You will see the truth. And if I refuse, then the contract defaults. We drain you. Richard gets his debt cleared, but he loses a stepdaughter. A tragedy, I'm sure he'll say at the funeral." Sophie grit her teeth. "Do it." Adrian inserted the needle. Sophie watched her dark red blood flow into the plastic bag. She felt lightheaded, the room spinning slightly. "That is the payment," Adrian said softly, sealing the bag. "Now the test." He picked up a syringe containing a small amount of shimmering obsidian-colored liquid. It looked like liquid night. "Look at me, Sophia," Adrian commanded. She locked eyes with him. "Do not fight the pain," he whispered. "Fight the despair." He injected the venom. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then Sophie screamed. It felt like he had injected liquid nitrogen and lava simultaneously. Her veins turned to ice, while her heart felt like it was exploding. Her back arched off the chair, the restraints straining. The world dissolved. The greenhouse vanished. She was standing in a burning room. It was her childhood home. She was 5 years old. She saw her father, a kind man with laughing eyes, arguing with someone in the shadows. The shadow stepped forward. It was Richard. "The company needs a stronger hand, Arthur," Richard sneered. I won't let you launder money through my ships, her father shouted. Richard sighed. He picked up a heavy bronze statue from the desk. Then you leave me no choice. Sophie tried to scream to warn her father, but she was a ghost in the memory. She watched Richard strike once, twice. The crunch of bone was sickening. The scene shifted. She saw Richard forging a suicide note. She saw him smiling at her mother at the funeral, a hand on her shoulder. She saw him slowly draining the company accounts, making bad deals on purpose to lower the stock value so he could buy it back cheap. She saw him meeting with the Sterlings, signing the ledger with a shaky hand, offering Sophie's name. She's nothing, Richard said in the memory. Just a brat. Take her. Clear the debt. The pain in Sophie's body peaked. The darkness of Adrian's blood was trying to tell her that humanity was rot, that betrayal was the only constant, that she should just let go and die. No. Sophie seized the anger, the spite that Julian had identified, the fire that Silas had tasted. She wrapped it around the memory of Richard's betrayal. She wouldn't die, not while that murderer was still breathing. She would burn the world down to get to him. She gasped, her eyes flying open. She was back in the greenhouse. She was drenched in sweat, gasping for air. Her veins pulsed with a faint violet light before fading back to normal. Adrian was staring at her, his notebook forgotten on the floor. He looked shaken. "You metabolized it," he whispered. In less than 2 minutes, Sophie slumped in the chair as he undid the restraints. She felt exhausted, but also strangely powerful. Her senses were dialed up to 11. She could hear the rain hitting individual leaves. She could smell the iron in her own blood sitting in the bag next to her. "I saw him," Sophie rasped. "I saw Richard kill my father." Adrian paused. He handed her a glass of water. "The blood shows truth, Sophia. It strips away the lies of the past." Sophie gripped the glass so hard it cracked. "He didn't just lose the money. He stole the company. He killed my dad. And he sold you to cover his crimes." Adrian finished. "A remarkably vile little man." "I passed," Sophie said, standing up. Her legs were steady. "I passed the blood trial." "You did," Adrian confirmed. He looked at her with a new expression. "Reverence. You are the first in 300 years to complete the triad." "My boon," Sophie demanded. "I want my boon." Adrian nodded. "Ask." "I have the key to the master's chamber," Sophie said, pulling the iron key from her dress. "But I don't know where the ledger is hidden inside the room." Silas said, "I have to burn it." Where is it?" Adrian walked over to a cabinet and pulled out a heavy velvet-wrapped bundle. "Silas is dramatic. The ledger is not hidden. It sits on the pedestal of the first Sterling, but burning it is not enough. The book is bound by the souls of those who signed it." He handed her a box of matches. They were long, tipped with silver. "These are sulfur matches dipped in holy water," Adrian said. "Only these can ignite the parchment. But be warned, Sophia. When you enter that room, the house will try to stop you. The curse protects itself." "I don't care," Sophie said, taking the matches. Her eyes were hard, the violet flecks from Adrian's blood fading, but leaving a cold resolve behind. "I'm not just going to break the contract, I'm going to ruin Richard." Adrian stepped aside. "Then go. The sun rises in 90 minutes. If you are not out by dawn, the completion of the trials won't matter. You will belong to the house forever." Sophie ran. She abandoned the elegance of her arrival. She kicked off her heels, running barefoot through the marble corridors of Blackwood Manor. The stone was freezing, but she didn't feel it. The drop of vampire blood in her system was acting like a super stimulant. She felt faster, stronger. She navigated the labyrinthine hallways, following the mental map she had built. West wing, 3rd floor, the double doors carved with weeping angels. The house was waking up. The shadows seemed to lash out at her, trying to trip her. Doors slammed shut as she approached. The chandeliers flickered ominously. "Get out of my way," Sophie screamed, not stopping. She reached the west wing. The air here was stagnant, smelling of old paper and ozone. She found the door. It was massive, made of black iron. She jammed Silas's key into the lock. It turned with a heavy thunk. Sophie pushed the door open and stumbled inside. The master's chamber was a circular room, located in the highest tower of the manor. The walls were lined with portraits of men who looked like Julian Silas and Adrian, stretching back centuries. In the center of the room, on a stone pedestal, lay the ledger. It was open. Sophie rushed toward it, the box of silver matches in her hand. Sophie. The voice stopped her dead. She spun around. Emerging from the shadows behind a tapestry was Richard. He looked disheveled, his tie crooked, sweat beading on his forehead. He was holding a heavy duffel bag that clinked with the sound of gold bars. "Richard," Sophie breathed, "you're supposed to be gone. I couldn't leave." Richard panted, his eyes darting around the room. "The gates, they locked when you went inside. I've been trapped in the gatehouse. I came back to find another way out, and I found the safe open." He gestured to a wall safe that had been ripped from its hinges. "You're robbing them," Sophie realized. "You sold me to them. And while I was fighting for my life, you were robbing them. I needed a retirement fund." Richard snapped his cowardice, giving way to greed. "Look, Sophie, we can both go. You survived. Good for you. Let's get out of here. Help me carry this." "You killed him," Sophie said, her voice deadly calm. Richard froze. "What?" "My father, you hit him with the bronze statue. You staged the suicide." Richard's face went slack. How could you know that the blood remembers?" Sophie said, stepping closer. "You didn't just sell me to pay a debt. You sold me to bury the last witness. As long as I'm alive, the company is rightfully mine. If I die here, you inherit the rest." Richard dropped the bag. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small revolver. "You were always a smart girl, Sophie. Too smart." He pointed the gun at her chest. "I didn't want to do this myself. I wanted the monsters to do it, but if I have to." Click! The door behind Sophie swung open. Sophie didn't look back. She kept her eyes on Richard. "Put the gun down, Richard." Julian's voice came from the doorway. It was low, vibrating with a terrifying anger. Richard's hand shook. "Stay back. I'll shoot her." Silas stepped into the room, followed by Adrian. The three brothers stood in a phalanx behind Sophie. They weren't looking at her. They were looking at Richard with the intensity of wolves spotting a wounded deer. "You brought a weapon into the sanctuary," Silas noted, sounding amused. "That's a breach of guest rights. She knows." Richard screamed, backing up until he hit the stone wall. "She knows about Arthur. I have to end it." "You will do nothing," Julian commanded. He didn't move, but the air pressure in the room plummeted. The windows rattled. "Sophie," Adrian said softly. "The ledger." Sophie turned back to the pedestal. The book was there. Her name was on the bottom line. Sophia Bennett, transfer of ownership. She struck one of the silver matches. It flared with a brilliant white light. "Wait," Richard yelled. "If you burn that, you void the deal. The debt comes back. I'll be ruined." "You're already ruined," Sophie said. She held the match to the page. The parchment didn't burn like paper. It screamed. A high-pitched wailing sound filled the tower as the fire curled the edges of the page. The ink boiled. "No!" Richard fired. The gunshot was deafening. Sophie flinched, waiting for the impact, but it never came. She looked up. Julian was standing in front of her. He had moved faster than sound. The bullet was flattened against the palm of his hand. He dropped the piece of lead onto the stone floor. Clink. The hole in his hand healed instantly. "You tried to damage my property," Julian said. His voice was no longer human. It was the voice of the abyss. "Property?" Sophie asked, the match still burning in her hand, the page half consumed. "I thought if I burned this, I was free." "You are free of the debt," Julian said, not turning to face her. He kept his eyes on Richard. "But you passed the triad, Sophia. You defeated my mind, you tamed Silas's body, and you survived Adrian's blood. Do you know what that makes you?" The brothers stepped forward, encircling Richard. Richard was sobbing now, sliding down the wall. "What does it make me?" Sophie whispered. Silas looked back at her, his grin feral. "It makes you the mistress of Blackwood. We don't have a master anymore, darling. We have a queen." Sophie watched as the fire consumed her name in the book. The binding snapped. The heavy leather cover fell shut. The curse was broken. The debt was gone. But the sun was rising. A beam of grey morning light cut through the storm clouds and hit the east window. "The sun!" Richard shrieked. "You'll burn all of you!" Julian turned to Sophie. "The contract is void. You can leave. You can walk out that door, take the car, and go back to Los Angeles. You can call the police on Richard, though they won't find much of him left by the time they arrive." "Or," Sophie asked. Or Adrian said, "you can accept the boon of the triad. You stay. You rule. We possess the wealth of empires, Sophia. We have influence in every government, every bank, every shadow. You wanted to restore your father's legacy. We can give you the world." Sophie looked at the trembling mess that was Richard. Then she looked at the three men. Monsters, yes, but monsters who had kept their word. They had tested her, but they hadn't lied to her. She looked at the sunrise. For the first time, she realized the brothers weren't burning. The breaking of the ledger had lifted the sunlight curse too. She walked over to Richard. He looked up at her, snot running down his nose. "Please, Sophie," he begged. "I'm family." Sophie looked at Julian. "If I stay, do I get to decide his punishment? He is yours." Julian bowed his head. "He is yours." Silas echoed, bowing. "He is yours." Adrian finished bowing. Sophie smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile. The smile of a queen. "Throw him in the dungeon," Sophie said, "and make sure he lives a very, very long time." Julian snapped his fingers. Richard vanished into the shadows, his screams cut short as the floor swallowed him whole. Sophie turned to the window. The storm had broken. The sun was rising over the ocean, painting the sky in gold and purple. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a sacrifice. She turned back to the three brothers who were kneeling before her. "Now," Sophie said, smoothing her dress, "about that shipping company. I have some hostile takeovers to plan, and I believe I'm going to need all three of you." The heavy iron door swung open with a groan that echoed like a dying breath, revealing the master's chamber. It was a cold, circular room, at the very apex of the manor, smelling of ozone and ancient dust. But Sophie didn't see the centuries-old tapestries or the priceless artifacts lining the walls. She only saw two things: the ledger sitting on an obsidian pedestal in the center of the room, and the man frantically stuffing gold bars into a duffel bag by the open-wall safe. Richard. Sophie's voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a whip. Her stepfather froze. He dropped a heavy bar of gold, the dull thud reverberating against the stone floor. He spun around his face, a mask of sweating, desperate greed. "Sophie!" Richard gasped, his eyes darting to the door behind her. You're alive! Thank God! We have to go now. You're robbing them!" Sophie said, stepping into the room. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold stone. The drop of Adrian's blood in her veins was still humming, heightening her senses. She could hear Richard's heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "You sold me to monsters so you could clear your debt, and while I was fighting for my life, you broke into their safe." "I did it for us," Richard pleaded, wiping sweat from his upper lip. He took a step toward her hands, raised in a placating gesture. "The shipping company is gone, Sophie. It's a sinkhole. I needed a parachute, a retirement fund. We can take this and disappear to the Cayman Islands, just you and me." Sophie stared at him, and for the first time she truly saw him. Not the imposing businessman she had feared growing up, but a small, pathetic leech. "I know, Richard," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I took the blood trial. I saw the memory." Richard stopped dead. The colour drained from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of grey. "What memory?" "I saw you in Father's study," Sophie said, walking closer step by deliberate step. "I saw you pick up the bronze statue. I saw you strike him. You didn't just ruin the company, Richard. You murdered him." Richard's trembling ceased. His expression shifted from fear to a cold reptilian resolve. He reached into his jacket pocket. "You were always too smart for your own good, Sophie. I told Arthur that his daughter would be a problem." He pulled out a snub-nosed revolver and levelled it at her chest. "I didn't want to do this." Richard sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I thought the vampires would take care of you, but I've come too far to let a little girl stop me now." Bang! The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed stone space. Sophie flinched, bracing for the impact, for the searing pain. It never came. A blur of motion swept past her, followed by the sound of metal hitting flesh. Sophie opened her eyes. Julian stood directly in front of her, his back to her, shielding her body with his own. He held his right hand up, palm facing Richard. Embedded in the center of his palm was the flattened lead bullet. Julian slowly closed his fingers over the bullet, crushing it into dust. The wound healed instantaneously. "You brought a weapon into the sanctuary," Julian said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a tectonic plate shifting. "And you attempted to damage my property." "Stay back," Richard screamed, backing up until he hit the cold stone wall. "I'll shoot, I swear to God. God is not in this room, Richard." A silky voice came from the shadows. Silas materialized on Richard's left, leaning casually against a suit of armor. "Only us and the debt," Adrian added, stepping out from the right, completing the circle. "The debt must always be paid." Sophie stepped around. Julian. The three brothers formed a protective phalanx behind her, ceding the floor to her. She walked to the obsidian pedestal. The ledger lay open, the ink of her name, still wet on the parchment. Sophia Bennett. She struck the silver match. The sulphur hissed and flared with a brilliant white flame. "Don't!" Richard shrieked, sliding down the wall in terror. "If you burn that, the deal is void. The creditors will come for me. I'll be destitute." "You won't be destitute, Richard," Sophie said calmly, holding the flame inches from the paper. "Sophie, listen to me. You'll be dead," she finished. She dropped the match. The parchment didn't just burn, it roared. A column of violet fire erupted from the pedestal, consuming the contract. The house shook, as if an earthquake had struck the foundation. The magical binding that had held the Sterling brothers to the will of the ledger for centuries shattered with the sound of breaking glass. As the flames died down, silence returned to the room. The heavy atmosphere of the curse lifted. Julian turned to Sophie. He didn't look at her with hunger anymore. He looked at her with awe. He slowly lowered himself to one knee. Silas followed, bowing his head. Then Adrian, "The contract is destroyed," Julian said, his voice reverent. "But you completed the triad, Sophia. By the ancient laws, you are not released. You are elevated." "Elevated?" Sophie asked, her heart pounding. "You own the debt," Julian said, looking up at her. "You own the estate. You own us." Sophie looked at the three most powerful predators on earth, kneeling at her feet. She looked at Richard, who was curled in a fetal ball, sobbing. She realized then that she wasn't just a survivor. She was a queen. "Get up!" Sophie commanded the brothers. They rose instantly. "What is your first order, mistress?" Silas asked, a wicked grin spreading across his face as he looked at Richard. Sophie walked over to her stepfather. He looked up at her, tears streaming down his face, snot running from his nose. "Sophie, please," he whimpered. "I'm family." Sophie looked at the sunrise breaking through the high tower window. The light hit her face, warm and real. "Family protects you," Sophie said coldly. You sold me, she turned to Julian. I want the shipping company back. Every asset he stole, every penny he hid. Find it. Done, Julian said. And him? Silas asked, nodding at Richard. Sophie turned her back on her stepfather. She walked toward the heavy iron door, her head held high. I don't care what you do with him, Sophie said as she walked out. Just make sure he lives a very, very long time to regret it. Bind him, the screams began. They were music to her ears. Sophie didn't just survive the night, she conquered it, walking out of Blackwood Manor as dawn broke. She wasn't the trembling sacrifice anymore. She was the head of the most powerful supernatural dynasty in the world. While Richard found his eternal torment in the dungeons below, Sophie took her rightful place at the head of the boardroom with Julian, Silas, and Adrian standing loyal at her side. They say the shipping business is cutthroat, but with 3 vampire enforcers behind her chair. Sophie Bennet never lost a negotiation again. What did you think of Sophie's revenge? And which brother was your favorite? The mastermind Julian, the wild Silas, or the mysterious Adrian? Let me know in the comments below if you loved this dark romance twist. Please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a thrilling story. Thanks for watching.